So what I would like to do first is thank everybody for joining us today, first of all, and I really appreciate Altshuler's joining us. I know it's a very busy time of year. I would like to introduce each of our guests, and then I'm going to ask them to just say a little bit about the type of courses they teach, and then their teaching philosophy, basically. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions and discussion, and then, of course, I want to leave enough time for questions from the audience. So let me just start. I'll just tell you who our panelists are. We have Herve Tchumkham, and I hope I pronounced your last name correct, Herve. He's an associate professor of French in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences. He teaches very sensitive courses, including post-colonial trauma and racism, and the impact his courses have on his students is visible. I'm going to stop there and I'll let him go into a little bit more about how he does what he does. Our next guest is Sandra Duhe. She is an associate professor and chair of corporate communications and public affairs in the Meadows School of the Arts, where I am in journalism. She says, when nominated for the Altshuler Award, one of her letters of recommendation included several superlatives and characterized her as the most effective scholar, teacher, administrator in the Meadows School. Wow, that's some big views there.
No pressure there.
No pressure there. No pressure there. And then finally, our last guest is Dale Carpenter, and he's a professor of law and the Judge William Holly Atwell Chair of Constitutional Law in the Dedman School of Law. That was a lot of law in one sentence. The Altshuler Award Review Committee noted the number of students who said he made them learn how to think as lawyers. Professor Carpenter uses a variety of efficient engagement tools to cater to his large courses, and students consistently rate him as one of the best teachers in the law school. So I'm going to stop there, and we can go back and start with Herve, if you would, in terms of talking a little bit about your courses and your pedagogical ways that you approach them.
All right, can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks, colleagues, for being here. As Karen said, I specialize in something called postcolonial studies, which is not a discipline in itself, but it's at the crossing at the boundary of, intersections of many disciplines. My basic background is in literature, French, Francophone, postcolonial literature, and political philosophy. But I've opened up my teaching as well as my research to fields, outside fields like human rights, basically. So the type of classes that I teach, Karen named a few. Postcolonial France deals with the African diaspora in France and questions related to identity and citizenship. It's actually a topic on which I wrote my first book. Then I have other classes like France and Algeria on the hierarchies. The hierarchies being these Algerians who were used by the French, only later to be abandoned in Algeria by the same French. And this created a whole human rights issue. One of the other classes that I love to teach very much, and based on students' appreciation, it's Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, in which I revisit the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda with a special focus on challenging the preconceived notion of human rights. Something that's front and center in that classes, and in fact in all my classes, is generally to ask oneself, what does it mean to be human? When we speak of humans, do we account for each and every human? If not, then can we speak of a shared humanity? So how I go about it is very simple. The first thing that I do is usually provide students with the tools that are necessary for the understanding of these issues produced in a context that is often very different from the one with which they are generally familiar. I touch on the African diaspora, the African continent, colonial, post-colonial issues. The second thing is to use cultural studies approach in order to offer a context in which they can measure the meaningfulness of whatever we study. The third move has to do with fostering critical thinking within and outside the classroom. So through those three principles, I'm going to sum it up. My goal is to make each student accountable for the material and issues that are under considerations. So beyond imparting them with critical knowledge on these political, historical, and social issues in the former colonized world, one of my long-standing interests deals with issues of otherness and marginality. And these issues are placed front and center in those classes that I teach. I could return to address a few points, but basically, very broadly spoken, that's what I do. I'm sorry about that, guys.
Thank you. Sandy, you want to go next?
Sure, and if it's okay, I'll share my screen briefly. But as a bit of background, I came from the corporate side before becoming a professor, and as chair of corporate communication and public affairs, I help prepare our students to be communicators on behalf of organizations that they care very deeply about. And I noticed over my years of teaching that whether I was teaching principles of public relations or data analytics or our consulting course or our corporate finance and communication strategy class, that there were points that would continue to come up that I wanted to remind students to be aware of as they were transitioning from student to eventually a professional in the field. So I really enjoy the part of my teaching that allows me to help prepare them for the field. And what I did after all those years of noticing all these bits that I would kept correcting students on or kept reminding them of, I came up with a 5-point mantra that I'll share with you on my screen. Let's see, that I use in particular in my introductory course. And here it is. So I sort of summed up many years of experience, both in the field and in the classroom, to guide students to be early, follow directions, get to the point, be grateful, and last but not least, show what you know. And the order does matter of this 5-point mantra. And what I've been able to do and have gotten a whole lot of benefit from doing is I incorporate this not only in an academic sense, but also in a professional sense. And it's really true for their personal lives as well. So when we talk about being early, it's the importance of showing up, not right on time, not running into the classroom 3 seconds before class begins, or worst off late, but getting to work on time, turning your assignments in on time, being present and timely is a sign of respect for others, and it's a great sign of their professionalism as well. Following directions, I will load little details into assignments, and I tell them the reason I do that is to make sure that they are looking at the details, that they are following directions, because we all know when you can get trusted with the small things, you can get trusted with the larger things. Again, whether that's personally or academically or professionally. So I give them opportunities throughout my class to demonstrate that they can follow directions. Getting to the point is essential. My students love to write, and they love to write big, flowery essays on occasion, and they want to, they would much rather have 5 pages to respond to a prompt as opposed to 1 paragraph. But I force their hand to get to the point, Karen, I know you can relate to this as well, that they've got to get down to the basics. What are the most important points in their writing, in their speaking? Do they know their subject matter well enough in order to be able to deliver a concise, effective point of communication, regardless of the topic? And then point number 4 is all about being grateful. Throughout CCPA, we have our students write thank you notes. We have division branded thank you notes that we give to our students when they're on campus or when we're traveling with them. So when we have guest speakers come to class, we're helping them continue to nurture these important networking relationships for themselves. So we encourage them, be grateful not only to the guest speakers who come to campus, but your internship employers, your colleagues, your other professors. And we really get them in the habit of expressing their gratitude. And last but not least, I share with them that when you're on time or when you're early, when you're able to follow directions, when you can get to the point and you show your gratitude, only then are people really going to be interested and receptive into what it is that you know. Then once you've done these first 4 points, you're ready to show what you know. And we certainly give them ample opportunities to do that as they're working with clients in our courses and in their internships while they're students as well. And my final point, Karen, that I wanted to share is this wonderful book called The Go-Giver. It's required reading for my students. I even purchased copies to give to all of our faculty and our advisory board members, because it is all about aligning yourself with the values of giving as opposed to getting or hoarding or going out to see what can I get, what can I accumulate, what's in it for me, but instead having a very different mindset. And this book is beautifully written in a business context, and it's wonderfully counterintuitive to what you would think of when you think of the business world. And the students, I find, have received a lot of benefit from it. And it aligns well with this 5-point mantra, that being grateful, being a mentor, being a help, delivering more value than others expect is naturally going to come back tenfold to these students in their professional lives as well. I even had one student who bought them for all of her family members for Christmas. So highly recommend. The mantra has worked well for me. If you've got things you keep correcting over time, come up with your own mantra that fits well with your philosophy and your subject matter. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. And Dale?
Sure, a little bit of background about me. When I graduated from law school, I went into the practice of law, large commercial litigation cases involving huge companies and lots of money in Houston and in San Francisco. And I did that for about 6 years. But I knew in the back of my mind that I really wanted to be teaching, and I didn't want to be involved in the commercial litigation world. So I applied to be a teacher, and I've been a teacher. I taught at the University of Minnesota Law School since 2000 to 2016, and then here at SMU from 16 to now. So that's 23 years of teaching. And, I teach in a professional school, which means we're training people to be lawyers. We're, in some sense, we are certainly imparting content to them. They need to know the law. They need to know about doctrine. But I think we're also acting in a capacity as role models for being a lawyer and thinking and talking like a lawyer. So that's part of what we're doing as well. And I think that's probably roughly transferable to all of us in teaching. We're in part role models for civil dialogue and discussion and learning and curiosity and all of those sorts of things. So that's kind of what I do. I don't think I have really I can't say that I have a real philosophy of teaching. I wish it were that systematized. I think I had 2 overwhelming fears when I started teaching back in 2000. First of all, we never go to school to be teachers. I never learned how to teach somewhere. I didn't get a degree in teaching or any kind of training. I was just thrown out there, and it was sink or swim. And I think I had 2 overwhelming fears when I started teaching back in 2000. And that was, number one, that I would be exposed as a fraud who knew nothing at all by my students. And then the second was that about 30 minutes into an hour-long class, I would run out of things to say, and I would stand there mute before the lectern with nothing else to do and just sort of walk off. I don't know if the first thing has ever happened. Maybe it has. I'm not sure if I've been exposed as a fraud, But I can tell you the second thing has never happened. There's never a lack of material in class. If you're engaged enough and interested and you love what you do, you just never run out of things to do. So like, I don't have a philosophy. I think I do try to observe some pretty simple rules, and then I'll talk about the kind of methods that I use in teaching. Very simple, basic rules that, that I don't think are very complicated to understand. And I think actually they roughly correspond to the mantra that Sandy introduced in some way. So this are not rules for the students to follow. They are rules for the students to follow, but mostly they're rules for me to follow. One is, I always start on time. Now, to me, that's a basic thing. You don't show up late to your class. You don't start late. You start on time. And I mean, I start on time. And I end on time so that I'm respectful of my students' time. They're paying for this service. And I think we all have to be respectful of that. That is such a simple thing. One would think it doesn't need to be said. But I have to tell you, I have heard students complain about teachers, even in law schools, who, they sort of show up 5 minutes late, they begin late, they're talking to people or what have you, or they end later than the class should end. And to me, that's not a good, that does not encourage a good learning environment, and it doesn't lead to a respectful learning environment. So I think that's a very basic thing. I like to dress up when I teach. I don't think people have to do that. I'll just tell you, I like to do that. So this is as casual as I will ever be seen around the law school. I'm usually wearing a coat and tie, and that's what I do when I teach. That's just my old fuddy-duddy part. I want the students. Part of the reason I think that I started doing that, and now I just do it out of habit, is that when I started teaching, I was only about 33 years old. You can guess how old I am now, but I was only about 33 years old. And I thought I have to do this. I have to dress up to get respect from the students. And I wore glasses initially that were mostly just for show so that I could look older. But now, of course, I have to use them because I can't see any longer. But so I like to dress like I want to set that respectful tone in the classroom. So that's important to me. I think it's important, even if you've been teaching for a very long time, and even if you've taught the same material over and over and over, which I've done, I think it's very important to prepare for every class, to think about how you're going to approach the class, maybe think afresh about how you're going to approach the class, maybe do the reading again. I mean, that's a very simple thing, but it's the kind of thing students will have this fresh in their mind. And you should have it fresh in your mind, I think, as well. That's at least what I try to do. I don't think you can just wing it and walk in, even though you're an expert and you've done it all before. I also try to adhere to the syllabus as closely as possible. This is a big deal with students. At least with our students, they want to know what they're expected to know and what they're expected to read for that class. And they want the discussion to follow that kind of thing and then move on to the next thing. That's sometimes hard to do, but I think it's important. I personally, unlike Sandy, don't use audio visual equipment. I'm terrible at audio visual equipment. The only thing I use is like a whiteboard. I personally find it kind of distracting. A lot of times I think students tend to focus on what's going on the slides and so forth, instead of thinking critically about what they should be engaged in thinking about. But I think it can be an aid if you know how to use it and you use it effectively. So I don't want to say I would never use it, and I do use it in a way that I'll mention in just a moment. As far as the sort of techniques I use, so my students come into every class having read some cases, some decisions from various courts on a particular subject matter. I expect them to have done the reading and to have thought about the reading and be prepared to discuss it. So I use a method of cold calling in class. I will call on random students, they don't know who they are, in advance, and I'll ask them about the material in ways that don't ask them just to recount the material, but critical analytical questions about the material. This is the Socratic method in law schools. And then I'll ask follow-up questions if I think they didn't quite get it right, or I'll ask someone else for a different perspective. Another technique that I use in class is role playing, so that I don't know how much this translates into other kinds of courses, but at least in law school, it's easy when the students have read a decision from a court, it's easy to ask them to take opposing sides in the argument that was before the court. And it's not asking them their personal opinions, because I teach about, LGBT rights, constitutional law, free speech, things that are often very controversial. I'm not asking them for their personal opinions, but I'm asking them to put themselves in the role of an advocate and practice that skill of advocacy. And it's actually useful if they don't agree with the position that they're taking, so that they have to get into that role of getting used to getting inside an opponent's argument, understanding that argument, and I think therefore being able to respond to that argument in a more effective way. If I don't find students taking up certain positions because they're just not supported or they're too controversial, I'll act as devil's advocate in class. And I want to get students used to being prepared to encounter ideas and concepts that they haven't encountered and that they disagree with, maybe sometimes profoundly disagree with. And then the one audio-visual technique that I use, which is other than the whiteboard, just writing things on a whiteboard, which I do sometimes. I don't really regard that as audio-visual, not very sophisticated anyway, but I do play for them occasionally arguments from the Supreme Court. And what I'll do is play that to the classroom as a whole, and then I'll stop the recording as a justice asks a question of an attorney, and then stop it before the attorney has a chance to answer, and then ask that a student, to answer that question that the justice gave. This sort of approximates as much as we can a kind of real life, very sophisticated experience. And then when the student gives the answer, I'll resume the recording and we can compare what the lawyer said in the case with what the student said in that case. And I think that's one of the classes, I have to say, where I think students enjoy the most, because they get that sort of, again, closest to possible experience in the classroom that they can get to being an advocate in the courtroom. I think if you love what you're doing and you go in there every day with enthusiasm, or almost every day with enthusiasm, that is going to be communicated to students. It's just going to be infectious, and they will absorb that kind of enthusiasm. The other thing I would say is I always have high expectations of my students. I never play dumb or allow them to play dumb or allow them to get away with not answering things sharply. And I really have high expectations, and ordinarily they live up to those expectations. So that's the way I try to teach. Again, I don't think it's a philosophy. I don't know if it counts as a philosophy, but these are just some of the things I do.
Thank you. I'm just going to open up a couple of questions to the panel, and then of course we'll open it up to everybody who's joined us today. But obviously all three of you have had great success in the classroom. But I also think that sometimes it's our failures that teach us the most, and that there's things that we learn along the way. What kind of advice would you give to new teachers in particular as you're sort of finding your way through the classroom? What are some of the things that you had to learn maybe through not such great experiences that made you better as a teacher?
Well, I can give you a lot of examples. I'll give you a couple of examples. These are such simple things, but in a large classroom, it was almost always possible for me to hear a student's response to a question. but it wasn't always possible for other students to hear what that student responded with, especially if the student responding was in the front and it didn't make its way to the back. So one kind of technique, in addition to just asking students to speak up when they respond, one kind of technique I learned from difficult experience was when as I asked a student a question, I would move away from the student, and so move almost to the other side of the room. And a student's voice naturally rises in volume because you've moved away from them if you're not so close to them. So that I think has kind of helped with just having students be able to participate. Another thing, when I taught one of my very first classes, I would ask a question of a student, and it was not the right answer to the question. And then I would turn to the student next to that student and say, now, so-and-so, please tell me why that student was wrong. I thought that was okay, but students were very put off by that. They didn't want to be called out as just wrong in the class. It kind of disrupted the environment of respect and understanding. There are ways to tell a student that they're wrong, and that you don't have to just come out and say it. And so that they didn't like that. And so I moved away from that particular technique.
Yeah, for me, I was teaching data analytics and presented an equation that was incorrect and had one of my very bright students correct me. And I said, no, this is right. And lo and behold, got back to my office, realized my error, and learned I was going to correct any mistakes of mine quickly and publicly. So as soon as I got back to my desk, I emailed the entire class and said, yes, lo and behold, Chad was absolutely correct. Kudos to him. Really proud of his ability to not only spot my error, but also have the courage and the professionalism to tell me about it. So when I've made those hiccups along the way, I remember once in a syllabus, I was really stressing to students the importance of, proper spelling and grammar and punctuation. And I had a punctuation error in my syllabus, and we all had a good laugh about it. But boy, I checked that syllabus even closer in semesters to come. So absolutely, we make mistakes if we're brand new teachers or we're longstanding teachers. And for me, correcting it publicly and quickly is the way to move on. And it actually, I think gives you credibility in your students' eyes too. We're human too.
Yes, my own experience is, I would say, maybe quite different based on who I am, identity-wise, and what I do, what I teach. One of the things that I had to correct myself, as soon as I got to the US, is that coming from a French system, you live in that system, and almost everybody is familiar with the issues that are being discussed. So when I got to the States, was at the University of Pennsylvania, I came in with the wrong assumption that these kids knew what I was talking about. And little did I know that most of them don't know what's happening outside of Pennsylvania, just like I've found out here. Some of them don't know what happens outside of Texas, much less, internationally. So I had to, readjust myself, and I came up with pretty good strategies. I'm not a lawyer. I have no knowledge of law at all, Dale. But whenever I introduce my classes, I want students, some of the topics that we're going to discuss are very difficult, very sensitive. But this is how I phrase it. I tell them, make sure to always remember, I teach you how to think, not what to think. You might disagree with me, but I want you to have a way of thinking. You're not bound to think the way I think. And actually, I have one very short example. A student, and I will always remember this, and that's how I knew that I had corrected myself. A student looked me in the eyes and told me flat out that that slavery wasn't a human rights issue. he said slavery was just about business. And knowing myself 10 years back, I would have kicked him out of the class right away. Students were very uncomfortable and they were saying, no, he has to leave the class. And I told them, no, look, we are at the university. Don't get offended. We are here precisely to understand the thought process. And I told the student, if you can explain yourself and convince me that it wasn't a human rights issue, then I'm ready to concede that it wasn't. So we got in a discussion, and I remember pushing the student to its limits very politely. And interestingly enough, as they put it, this student became one of my best friends on campus until his graduation. And he actually asked me a letter of recommendation, something that I would have never thought. So I guess what I'm saying is, briefly put, being sensitive to cultural differences, you know, and as a person of color, being told that slavery is not a human rights issue, other students were amazed by how I reacted. Many came to me in the office and said, you should have kicked him out of the class. It's unacceptable. And I told them, that's why I'm here. I'm here on a journey, on a learning journey with you. I learn from you as much as you learn from me. So if a student has a point, I will hear him out and I'll be very honest in deciding whether or not he has that point, you know. So I think my own take of it is much based on that cultural relativity, because obviously the issues that I teach, I mean, you imagine teaching genocide to kids who sometimes have never left their families. It can be really, really challenging, you know, and all the assumptions. Oh, well, it's black violence, it's Africans killing Africans, Africans are bloodthirsty. So I learned from my early mistakes that we are actually here on a trip together, and whatever I consider basic knowledge could be special knowledge for a student. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So once I integrated that, I think everything became quite fantastic finally.
Herve, I think you just touched on something in terms of how do we engage students in difficult conversations in the classroom, because you know there's a level to be had, and I think you sort of answered that, but I'd like to hear from all of you. How do you do that? How do you engage students in that way?
Herve, did you want to respond, or Sandy?
Not really, Dale. I was just thinking of a scene. Speaking of law, and it's good that you're on this panel, Dale. You've probably all watched this movie, right? The Right to Kill, with Samuel Jackson. And you know, this lawyer who tells the story of a victim and tells the jury and the whole court to close their eyes. And at the end, he says, imagine they were white. I don't proceed that way because I don't have those legal knowledge. But what I usually tell students is I tell them, it's going to be difficult, but listen to what I'm saying. Blame the message, not the messenger. Don't look at me as the person talking to you. Understand what the rationale of what I'm saying. And for once, try to put yourself in the shoes of those people. Then maybe we can start a conversation. And it's proven very, efficient with time, because usually there is this tendency to look at those, especially racial issues, as statistic issues. And then I'm always saying, but, and the best example that I get, I hope Rick Alprin was here, was telling them, this might sound as something which is normal, but hey, remember, it is this same type of process that led Hitler to do what he did. So as we are witnessing silently, we could become victims tomorrow, And usually when I succeed in branching them that way, generally I win them and the rest of the class just follows, much to my surprise. So that's one of the ways that I used to play with that, just creating this sense of the self as the other, regardless of race, gender, class, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so my classes, I think, deal with very sensitive issues. In Constitutional Law 1 and Constitutional Law 2, we deal with things like affirmative action, racial inequality, gay rights, transgender rights, sex discrimination, abortion. Same things I teach an LGBT rights course, same sorts of very sensitive issues that are often quite personal for people. And I think the thing about our students is they come from every conceivable background. I mean, it's one of the great things about teaching, I think, and all kinds of different personal perspectives and experiences, every race, every sex, every gender, every political view. Some are strongly pro-choice, some are pro-life, and so forth. So there are a lot of people and a lot of different perspectives, and I think we have to be respectful of those perspectives. That's one. I think that we have to be mindful that they are there. And at least in my courses, as I mentioned earlier, I don't tend to ask students what their personal views of a given issue are. Instead, and I never talk about my personal views of an issue. Instead, I ask them to take sides or to present an argument for a particular view, even if they don't agree with it. And again, I think it's especially useful when they don't agree with an argument because they get to understand their argument more. And law students, at least, are, I think, primed to think in that way and respond in that way. I have almost never encountered a law school classroom discussion where I thought that some inappropriate language or personal reference was made from one student to another. I mean, one thing I would not tolerate is a personal insult from one student to another. I tell them you can express all manner of views about things, but no personally directed comment will ever be acceptable. And I've just never encountered that in law school. It might be different at the undergraduate level, but I think by the time they get to law school, these are professionals. These are people ready to go into a career where they know they're going to encounter a whole lot of different views. So I think I may be fortunate in that sense. But anyway, I conduct the class in a way that doesn't call on them to invest personally in the discussion of the class.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on Dale's comments, in corporate communications, you're going to encounter and be asked to speak about and represent issues that you may or may not agree with. Despite what happens behind closed doors, when you walk out of a meeting and there's a position to be stated, students need to get accustomed to speaking on behalf of issues that they may not agree with. So in my classroom, as Dale said as well, I do my utmost best to not exclude any voices, regardless of their point of view. I want every student to feel like they do have a voice and an opportunity and a safe setting to air their thinking. So to the extent possible, I will go back to the content of whatever it is that we're studying and use that sort of as the foundation for differing points of view, and have students use our material that we're covering to make their points or counterpoints. But I absolutely would not allow any student to feel threatened or somehow insulted or highly offended in my classroom, because that serves to cut off communication, not to enhance it. But I do try to air a disagreement or air a different point of view as much as possible, because the last thing I want to do is silence it and just ignore it and sweep it under the rug and try to move on. But it's a balance, right? You've got to make sure that you've got open flowing communication where everyone, to the extent possible, feels like they're being heard. But I never would allow for, students to get any type of personal insults or fights in a classroom setting. And as Herve said too, sometimes from that disagreement comes some new understanding that if you had not aired that discussion, so many students in the room would have been, oh, I was thinking the same thing, but I never would have been brave enough to say it.
I just wanted to piggyback on both of you and saying it's very interesting because I now realize, I mean, I knew for Dale Law School, so they actually have to go through us, right, before they get to law school. So we kind of shape them in the best way we can. For Sunday, you know, corporate communication, it's geared towards professional life. I guess the challenge here, and I'm sure my colleague Ruben, who is on the call, would agree with me, is that when you do what we do in humanities, right? You're introducing them to these basic issues of humanities. There is, whether you like it or not, you're gonna have to get students who say stuff that are very inappropriate. But the way I've learned to work on it is I don't perceive it as being racist. I perceive it as being ignorant to begin with. And what I do is, you know, say, for example, you try colonization. Very simple question, Karen. We met in front of Humphrey Lee the other day, and I was just out of a conversation with a student who till now is having a hard time figuring out why is it that Algerians had to resort to violence to get independence. And during the whole semester, and I just realized that he hadn't just factored it, because I would ask the question, so why did the Americans need to fight the British? And he told me, oh, of course, they were imposing taxes on us, they were taking our land. And I was like, and what about the Algerians? If you follow the class carefully, isn't that the same thing? He started saying, yes, but I'm like, but what? Unless Algerians are not as humans as Americans, then you have a point. And then the student just went completely, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that. Now I get it. You see, so there is a way, at least for undergraduates, and the graduate that I have in liberal studies, I don't have those type of issues. First of all, they're all professionals, and they come back for a doctorate in liberal studies. So I can go head on to it, you know, very open, very contentiously at times. But with undergraduates, I feel like we in humanities, we have to, you know, really take it. We have to take those punches in. And in a sense, I don't know if this metaphor works, but like Aikido, you know, use their own strength to beat them on their own ground. And that's something that I think, especially if you do critical race theory, I'm sorry to say here, it's something you have to be prepared to do that. Otherwise, you lose your mind right away.
In fact, I give students an assignment and I title it Seek First to Understand, Then to Be Understood. And they have to seek out someone who vehemently disagrees with them on a very personal topic. And I walk them through a process to seek first to understand where that person's coming from before they start defending or promoting their own point of view, and then to turn the table and see if that person gives them the same courtesy. Now, I don't share their topics, but these students have really done a deep dive on some really tough topics. And it's been a very beneficial experience for them because I want to, again, give them the tools that they can use in a professional realm when they're working with someone with whom they vehemently disagree. And I encourage them, understand where they're coming from. And Herve, as you said, it opens their eyes a lot. I'm not asking them to change their mind. That is not at all the purpose of the exercise, or to change the other person's mind. But what I want them to do is to understand where each other's coming from. I think the world could use a little more of that today too.
Thank you so much for your very thoughtful responses. At this point, I'd like to open it up to everybody else to ask the questions that you would like to ask of our panelists. Go ahead, Linda.
So, you know, I always have a question. I really enjoy these sessions. And first, I just want to thank CTE for offering these and panelists for sharing your time and wisdom. So I just love teaching the international students that we have at SMU. We do service courses for them in advanced English communications. And then I try to add enrichment like service learning and bringing in guests from the campus and the community as native speakers or with topics that are of interest to them. So I'm really interested in knowing if our panelists have, in mind the needs of international students in your various disciplines and how we might, better work with you in order to serve them. And if it's okay, I can put in the chat just links to the courses and workshops and activities that we do have for them, graduate students, mostly some undergraduates, and other projects. And so much of what you all have said just reminds me of other things that really I admire on the campus, like Sandy, when you mentioned the difficult topics. I was remembering Jill DeTemple's reflective structured dialogue training that I wasn't able to take because it conflicted with my teaching schedule, but that's the sort of thing I like to introduce in the classroom, as well as Braver Angels for political, diametrically opposed political views, and finally service learning off campus, such as the refugee advocacy projects that I offer to students that I mentor in engaged learning and Caswell and other types of activities. So that might all just sound rather random, but any of it, anything that might touch on an interest or something that anyone would like to share would be of interest to me. Thank you.
Well, Linda, I just want to say hats off to you. I'm in my 5th year in residence at Cockrell-McIntosh Commons, and SMU really understood early the importance of students being able to find their own community, that they can come into this new world of college life as long as they have some sense of community amongst people who, they share a similar background or they share similar interests with. So thank you for doing that. I think you will find the faculty and residents to be terrific allies for the work that you do, because I'm leaving in a month. So I'm completing my term, but the faculty and residents team is extraordinary in helping to connect students to opportunities like those you were offering. And they're also wonderful liaisons to help students get more engaged in activities on campus and off. So I would encourage you to include them in your circle, because they're always looking for activities to host and events to host for students. And I'm sure you'd have lots of ideas to not only share with them, but also have some activities within the residential commons that could appeal to and assist those international students, at least.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Sandy. And actually, yes, back when the commons were built and I was communicating with Dustin Gratch and a variety of others to connect our programs. So yeah, we do advertise our courses there too, but probably need to do a little more. What I really wanted to do was, be able to bring some of our students over to the activities at the various commons and see if they developed like an affinity for certain one or the other and establish partnerships. So try that again sometime. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Dale, you mentioned that, we went into teaching without any training. What are some things that you have learned from other professors that you've had that you've taken into your teaching that kind of guided you, that were able to guide you at the start of your career? And how about you, Sandy and Herve? What was your training? Did you have any training in pedagogy as you went into teaching? And if not, what are some things that you have learned from your professors that, you've taken into the start of your career?
Yeah, so actually, I learned a couple of really important things that I incorporated in my teaching from teachers that I had. And so I think that I largely model my teaching on the way I learned, or what was good for me. I hope it's good for other people, but it was good for me. And so I would say I do a couple of things. One of them is that I offer a brief, sometimes not so brief, recap of the prior class at the beginning of the next class, of every class, so that students can take away the things that just organizationally, the things that were the most important matters that we discussed. And that was extremely valuable to me. I think this is the thing that I most, of all the comments that I get in my reviews, the recaps of the prior classes stuff get the most gratitude from students. Is by far, easily. So that's one thing. The other thing that I do that I don't know how many other professors do it, but my professor did this when I was in law school. And that was during that recap, the professor would not only recount the important stuff that we discussed before, but he would name the students associated with that discussion, call them out by name. And he would make it sound better than we sounded when we were actually talking about it. And it kind of made us feel special. It made us feel like, you know, we were really smart, and he's now expected us to be even smarter. And sure enough, we did even better, I think, as a result. Students love to hear their name, and they like to hear their name in association with things that are good and smart and important. And I think it kind of leads to a supportive, encouraging, positive class environment.
Thank you. I'll say my experience is pretty similar. Again, coming from a French system, which is very top down, you know, something that I learned, or the most important thing that I learned when I got here to University of Pennsylvania, was that we as students, we were front and center of the class. I mean, the way my professors in grad school would teach us at Penn is completely different from the way we were being taught at the Sorbonne in France. Completely different. In France, he walks in, he delivers a surgical strike, and he leaves. Here, I learned I come in knowing what I do, and that's how I try to replicate it in my classes. I know exactly what I want to do, but I organize it as a trip. And I make sure that students have the impression that they are the one leading me to discussing these things that I actually prepare to discuss with them. And that gives them a feeling of, oh, we're actually contributing to this, and we actually know more than we know, even if I know that they are just learning. But I just put them in, and this is, I would say, the most important thing I learned from graduate school in the United States, which was interesting because I complained when I came here from France, having gone through a doctorate. I was like, why do I have to go through grad school again? But I couldn't be grateful now that I went through grad school here, because I will know my stuff, but I will be the poorest teacher ever if I hadn't done grad school here. I just have to say that way.
Yeah, I did my graduate work while I was working full time. So I was never working as a teaching assistant. And so I just took the best of what my professors had to offer. And for me, as a working adult going to grad school, I had a very full calendar other than just going to school. So I always appreciated and mimic today a very detailed syllabus that I will adhere to. And I find that it gives students something so simple, something so fundamental, a lot of relief. And they sort of exhale when they see we have a schedule. Now I can schedule everything else I have going on around this class. They know that I respect that they have other things going on. But to Dale's earlier point, I also have exceedingly high expectations of them. And they know that what the schedule is, what my expectations are. So I don't compromise and I don't negotiate those. And I don't find that I have to. And surprisingly, students in my evaluations will say, I just love the syllabus and how she sticks to what she said she was going to do. Something so fundamental just seems to bring them a lot of relief.
And I never put things to a class vote. I'll just say that. Never, ever. because you're going to do what you want to do. And if they have voted against it, they're not going to like that, and they'll be invested in it. And if you're going to do what the majority voted for, then the other half are going to feel left out or somehow disadvantaged. So don't ever put something to whatever it is. I would not put it to a class vote. That's just my advice. I've done that, and that was a mistake.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question.
Sure, Kendall.
Sandy, I think in particular. How do you get students to actually like read and engage with the syllabus? Or is that something that you don't really have to worry about? Because I find I have a very detailed syllabus and I stick to it. And I just find that students are just not, they're not reading it closely even when I do a syllabus quiz. And then I'm getting a lot of questions about the syllabus that are answered by the syllabus. So yeah, if you have any tricks, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Yes, I've done the syllabus quiz. It's worked typically well. But what I find is praising the students who are clearly following the syllabus in class and making a big deal about that. What starts to happen is someone will say, now, when is the midterm? And the other students around them will say, it's in the syllabus. And I don't have to say anything. It's a beautiful thing to watch. So I think praising those who do, having the detail in it, and also being, when they have a question, it's in the syllabus. Let me know if you have questions thereafter. And then it takes a few weeks, perhaps, for them to get it. But once they do, it's really nice when the students start doing that job for me. So praise those who get it, even if it's the smallest thing. And others will hopefully start to follow suit.
Thank you.
And maybe in 1 second, Kendall, because I've had those issues with syllabi myself. I was just given a hint by my former chair, Dana, to put on the syllabus, the schedule is subject to change unless otherwise directed by the professor. That took a lot of complaints away. That's the first thing. The other thing, even when we moved to simple syllabus, I will still print syllabi and distribute that to students in class, and yet find out that they take it, they lose it, they don't read it, they don't go to look at it. So one thing I do is, if I know that I'm going to change something, because sometimes I have to adjust the class, I could return to a certain lecture, spend more time on it because I think it's fundamental to progress, for the progression. So what I will do is tell them in the class before then, this is what we'll be doing, but then follow up with another email saying, remember, like I said in class, this is what we're doing. And I think, just those type of little tricks have been helpful, I would say, for me in the long run.
Thank you.
Simon asked in the chat if anyone has ever had to call campus police regarding a student.
No, thankfully not.
No, I've never had to call the police. We did have a student about 15 years ago at my other law school who was making some veiled threats to other students on campus, and he was in my class, but I didn't actually have to do anything, so it was taken care of.
Okay. Thank you. He also said he had to do that this semester. So I'm sorry that happened to you. That's not an easy thing to do. Well, we've reached the end of our time here, so I want to adhere to what I've learned here and ending right on time. I do that anyway. But again, many thanks to you. This was a very rich conversation, and I hope it's something that we'll be doing each spring with our new crop of Altschulers. So I really applaud you for joining us, and for the audience for coming as well. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, John. Goodbye.